brainstorming. It is a best practice in negotiation, and yet it often gets a bad name. So people use brainstorming incorrectly in negotiation. And in this video, I'm going to give you 3 steps on how to make brainstorming a useful and productive activity. So let's start at the beginning. So first, before you do any brainstorming at all, it's critical to identify what are the issues up for negotiation and what are the interests of all of the parties with respect to those issues. In negotiation, we talk about distinguishing positions from interests. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I have lots of videos on how to identify interests in negotiation. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please sure to do so now. Now, why is it important to start by identifying the issues and the interests first? It's for this reason. If you are just doing random brainstorming and it's not tethered to the actual interests of the parties, it could be A, unproductive, B, it can almost feel like a roadblock in the negotiation, and C, it's not that useful. If we're going to do brainstorming, it has to be based on what are the actual interests of the parties. And so if you ever go into a meeting with me and we're there for 5 minutes and someone says something like, let's brainstorm ideas on what our strategy should be in the next 6 months, I will always stop. And I'm not stopping because I don't like brainstorming. I love brainstorming. It's just that if I don't know what the interests are, what are we brainstorming about? So this, I think, is the critical mistake that people make. It's that they begin brainstorming, but it's brainstorming untethered to the underlying interests. Now, once we have the underlying interests of the parties, the second important thing to do before we begin brainstorming is to actually establish rules for brainstorming. And this is another common error that people make. Someone says, okay, let's brainstorm ideas, and then everyone starts doing it. The problem with that is that most people don't really know what are the rules for brainstorming, or maybe they're using a set of rules or guidelines that aren't that helpful. And so I always like to be really transparent when we're moving to the brainstorming phase. And yes, it is a specific period of time or phase in negotiation. Then let's agree that these are the rules we're going to follow and that we're going to enforce them. So rule number 1 is just to say that all ideas are good ideas, meaning that we're not going to, in this part of the negotiation or in this part of the meeting, be evaluative. And the reason for that is as soon as we become evaluative, it actually diminishes creativity. People, instead of coming up with lots of ideas, start evaluating whether it's a good idea before they even throw it out there. So a common error that people make here is that they don't say anything like, Bob's idea is terrible, but what they do say is when an idea comes forward that they like, they'll be like, great idea. Well, of course, if some ideas are getting labeled great and others have no comment, guess what? That's evaluation. So one of the rules is no evaluation at all. All we're going to do is say, here's an idea and here's what set of interests it's linked to. So let's move on to the next important rule, which is no attribution. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we're collecting ideas, we want to be putting them maybe on a flip chart or on an Excel spreadsheet, but we don't want it to be labeled with, this is Joanne's idea, or this is Alexis's idea, or this is Kalisha's idea. Because as soon as it has a name to it, we are stuck with a psychological dynamic that is called reactive devaluation. So there's a lot of research on reactive devaluation, but what it has shown is that when an idea is attached to a certain individual or party, people on the other side of that negotiation will actually value that idea less highly. So some of this research was done in the 80s at Stanford. Students were shown a nuclear disarmament plan, and some of them were told, this is a plan put forward by US President Ronald Reagan. Please rate how favorable it is to the United States. Then the same exact plan was put forward to a different set of students, and they were told that this is the plan put forward by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Please rate it as how favorable it is to the United States. It turns out that when the plan was called the American plan, American students rated it much higher than it was called the Soviet plan, even though it was the same exact plan. So let me give you an idea here that I have seen used in some contexts. And it is actually technology that allows people to brainstorm ideas by typing them into a computer that then projects all of the ideas on a screen, but does it in a time-release way, meaning that I might type something in and 45 seconds later, my idea comes up there. Because it's time-release, literally no one can track whose idea is what that's appearing on the screen. And the whole idea of this is to avoid that reactive devaluation problem. Last important step here is that when we're moving into a brainstorming phase, it's actually important to get the right people in the room. What do I mean by this? Well, in a negotiation, not everyone is equal when it comes to brainstorming. That's not because of people's inherent ability to be creative. I mean, we all have different capacities to be creative, but it often relates to the role that people have. So what do I mean by this? Well, oftentimes a decision maker feels less freedom or less able to brainstorm. Well, why is that the case? Because the decision maker may worry that any idea they put out there is a suggestion that they think it's a good idea. And so therefore they may self-censor. Moreover, when we have bosses or decision makers in the room, at times people might hold back putting out something that they think might be a little bit loony or a little bit crazy, because even though it might not get evaluated publicly, they're worrying that their boss might do an internal eye roll and say, like, that's a crazy idea. And so making sure you have people in the room who have enough freedom to not self-censor, because really, actually nobody thinks that they can make the decision, can be really helpful. You know, in his biography, The Promised Land, Barack Obama talks about times when he needed advice from his senior advisors and would purposefully leave the room. And he did this so that people really could do some good brainstorming without constantly glancing across the table, looking at him to see whether he approved or disapproved. Truth of the matter is, brainstorming is a critical and important part of every mutual gains negotiation. But it often gets a bad name. And it gets a bad name because people don't do it at the right time and they don't follow the right rules. If you want to do this successfully, follow these 3 steps. First, identify the issues up for negotiation and then record all the interests of the parties. Then, using those interests, establish some very clear rules for brainstorming and make sure those rules are adhered to. Lastly, for the brainstorming part of a negotiation, make sure you get the right people in the room, people who are most able to actually do brainstorming. So, to continue learning, watch this next video, which is how do I negotiate when the other side has more power? Okay, you know you want to learn how to deal with powerful negotiators.